Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our presentation this morning. Let's pull back the curtain here and get started on our presentation here. So while that's coming up, just a reminder that all attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature inside of WebEx, and I will get to the questions at the end of the presentation. Okay, just an apology before I start. If I cough into the microphone here, I apologize. I've been fighting a cough here that can't seem to shake, so apologies in advance here. So our topic today is going to be OneDrive versus Teams versus SharePoint. Which of these applications is the right fit for different use case scenarios? But before we do that, just a little bit about Colden Company. If you're not familiar with us, we are an information technology service organization. We're an MSP, or managed services provider. So a little bit more on that logo in a second here. But we've been in business since 2003. We have offices in St. Augustine, Florida, which is where I'm talking to you from today, in Ballston Spa, New York, and also now in Jonesville, Michigan. Our customer footprint extends into 17 states, as well as a couple countries outside the U.S. And we have many leading technical certifications. I won't go through them all, but what's pertinent for today is we do hold Microsoft Silver competency for cloud solutions for small to mid-sized business, and that is what the OneDrive for Business, Teams, and SharePoint fall under. And our last bullet point here says that we are an MSP 501 award winner. Something we're kind of proud of. What that is, that's an organization called Channel Futures or Channel Partners that evaluate MSPs, and there's 40,000 of us in the United States here. They look at your business practices. So they look at things like what kinds of services are you offering, what percentage is cloud versus on-premise, those types of things. They want to make sure you're keeping up with things. They look at efficiencies and anyway, it's a exhaustive process here, and we were very proud to have been selected as one of the top 501, so the best of the best, as they say. Beyond that, we were very pleased to learn that we actually came in third place for their MSP of the Year award. That's like the best picture at the Oscar. That's the final award. That's kind of the big one, and out of all the computer companies worldwide, we came in third place. That's pretty darn good. They just announced this week the winners of the 2021. Actually, they didn't announce any specific award winners, but just who's in the list for 2021. And Colden has also made the list for 2021, so something we're proud of. But you didn't come here to hear about that. You want to get to our agenda here. While you do that, I'm just going to open up a poll question and just ask, which of these Microsoft services are you using today? You can select multiple ones. So please go ahead and fill that out while I continue talking here. So what we're going to do is give a brief description of OneDrive, Teams, and SharePoint. What this presentation is not is a deep dive into any of those three. We have done webinars in the past where we've done a little bit of a deeper dive into those. That's not what we're going to do today. Today we're going to be focusing on which one of these tools is right for your use case scenario. If you are interested in that, if you go to Colden Company's website, coldencompany.com, and you'll see a link for Colden TV. We do have recordings of our past webinars, and you'll find in there a deeper dive into OneDrive, deeper dive into Teams. We recently did one on Power Automate, which is in that poll question there. So if you're looking for that, we can help you there, but that's not going to be what we're focusing on today. So we'll just briefly make sure we're on the same page with a description of those items. We're going to look at the underlying infrastructure for Microsoft 365. I think having that basic understanding will really help. We'll talk about the similarities of each of the tools, and then finally get to the meat of things here and talk about use cases for each of the tools, where it makes sense to use each of these. And of course, we'll take some questions. Okay, looking at our poll question here, it looks like SharePoint appears to be the one with the most use. I'm surprised at that, actually. I would have thought Teams would have been higher. And nobody using Power Automate. There's a lot to Power Automate. It's a great tool. We won't focus too much on that today, but if you're using Microsoft 365 for an email platform, that's great, but there's just so much more value in there for the subscription. We consider OneDrive for Business, SharePoint, Teams, the things that we're talking about today as kind of a phase 2 if you're rolling out Microsoft 365. Those add great value to your subscription. And once you get those things in place, then you can move on to more advanced things like Power Automate. But Power Automate has a lot of sample, what they call them, flows that Microsoft gives you. And a lot of the flows assume that you have that basic infrastructure in place. You have SharePoint in place already. You have Teams deployed. So that is kind of what we consider a phase 3 to move into things like Power Automate, where you can start talking about business process improvement or business process automation. And just an example of what I'm talking about there, I won't spend too much time on it, but we did a project for a customer where they have invoices that come into a particular email box. And what we did is we set up Power Automate flow so that it saves any of the attachments, any of the invoices into a particular channel in Microsoft Teams, and that channel was named Invoices Awaiting Approval. And then the AP person can send that off to whoever needs to get it approved. There's an approval process built in there. So whoever needs to approve it would get an email with a nice big button that says approve this invoice, reject this invoice, and of course they can view the invoice. And depending on which they choose, if they accept the invoice, it automatically, through Power Automate, moves that attachment from that channel into another channel called Invoices Approved for Payment, and those types of things. So that's the kind of thing that you can do once you've got all this basic infrastructure in place. Okay, so let's move on to OneDrive for Business. Just very briefly, what is it? At its core, it is a cloud file storage solution. So it's meant for file storage. What it is not OneDrive Personal. So if you've ever opened a Windows 10 computer out of the box, you might see a little white cloud in the system tray that is OneDrive, but that's going to be OneDrive Personal. And I've got a little diagram, not a diagram, but a picture here of two different clouds, two different icons. The blue cloud would indicate that you're using OneDrive for Business. The white cloud would indicate that you're using OneDrive Personal. Some of the differences: OneDrive for Business has 1 terabyte of storage versus only 5 gigs for the Personal. There's also some other differences, such as encryption. Your data is encrypted on Microsoft's site if you're using OneDrive for Business. It is not if you're using OneDrive Personal. But that OneDrive for Business is included with most Microsoft 365 subscriptions, not included with the perpetual licenses. So if you're buying a retail or OEM copy of the Office applications, you're not getting that. But if most of the subscriptions, if you're buying them from Microsoft, is going to include the OneDrive for Business license. Okay, Microsoft Teams. At its core, it's a collaboration tool. That's really what it's meant for. A lot of people use it as kind of an instant messenger and a chat, because you can communicate via instant message back and forth. Also, people use it a lot for the video calling and attending webinars and such, which you can do with Teams as well. Again, it's included with most subscriptions. Microsoft Teams is available as an app that you download on your computer. It's available in the browser, so you don't need to have that app loaded. For example, if somebody doesn't have a Microsoft account, they can still attend the Teams meeting through the browser. And there's a handy app as well that goes on the phone. And we've helped customers that have technicians out in the field. They've got the Teams app on their phone, so they can actually open up Teams, go to a particular customer's Teams site, and snap pictures of equipment and things like that, and they're automatically saved into that team. And so people back in the office or wherever, as long as they have access to that team, they can see those photos immediately. So that app can be very handy. It's also handy for sharing video and things like that. So if you want to show a teammate what you're looking at, you can do the video call in Teams and they can see what you're looking at. So just some terminology, if you hear me talking about it, I mentioned teams and channels. You can have, basically channels are underneath a team. So you can have several channels underneath a team. You might have an accounting team for your business, and under there you might have an accounts payable channel or an accounts receivable channel. You might have a team for a customer, and then you might have different channels for different projects that you have going on for that particular customer. So a channel is just something that is underneath a team to give you some granularity in where you're putting your files. Okay, and last but not least, SharePoint, at its core, it is a file repository for storing files, and that may sound familiar. OneDrive for Business is also a file repository, and that's where some of the confusion comes in. Is, well, they both store files, they both store them in the cloud. Which should I use for which purpose? And that's the point of our presentation here today, is to help figure that out. So there's a lot to SharePoint. We're not going to get into a lot of the details on that. There are people who make an entire career out of using or administering SharePoint. Some terminology, if we're talking about it, they have sites. So you create a SharePoint site, and then underneath it, you can have a SharePoint library. So where in Teams, you've got a team and a channel underneath it. In SharePoint, you have a site with a library underneath it. You can have multiple libraries underneath a site. There's also something called a site collection, which is a group of sites that have some commonality to them. Okay, so that's just a brief review of what all those things are. So here is kind of a picture that Microsoft gives out. It's dated, it says Office 365, not Microsoft 365, which is their rebranded name of it. It's a kind of a listing of different applications, different front-end applications. You've got your Microsoft Word up here, and Skype for Business, and SharePoint. You've got lots of different applications that are part of Office 365. And it can be confusing, which one do I use when, right? So let's talk about what's really going on behind the scenes. Although Microsoft has many front-facing applications, you've got your Outlook and Excel, Teams, etc. On the back end, there's really just two main data repositories. That is Microsoft Exchange and Microsoft SharePoint. Those are the two areas. If you're storing files, they're going to go to one of those two places with Microsoft 365. So with Exchange, you've probably heard of that. That's kind of the gold standard for email. That's, of course, their email application, but also calendar events would get stored in Exchange. Any contacts that you have, those things are stored in Exchange. So if you look at applications, Outlook is an application that deals with emails. Calendar events could be Teams or Outlook. So that's important to note that if you create a meeting in Teams, it's not syncing that calendar event to Outlook. They're both looking at the same exact calendar on the back end, and that's a Microsoft Exchange calendar. So both Outlook and Teams use the exact same calendar. It's not two calendars that are syncing together. So you'll notice if you create a meeting in Teams, it automatically pops into your Outlook. It might take a few seconds. That delay is not Teams syncing to Outlook, it's Outlook syncing to Exchange, which Teams updated. So it's the same calendar that both applications are viewing. Same thing with contacts. Teams and Outlook both are going to be handling the same contacts that are stored in Microsoft Exchange. So that's the main purpose of Exchange. SharePoint, on the other hand, is meant for files. There's also something called SharePoint lists. It's also meant for collaboration. If you're doing any type of collaboration on files, that's one of the beautiful things of Microsoft 365. When we talk collaboration, we mean having two people using a spreadsheet at the same time. You can do that with Office Online. You can do that inside of Teams. All that ability comes from SharePoint is really providing that. So if we look at different applications, you'll notice Teams is also talking to SharePoint. So Teams is talking to both of the different data repositories. In fact, when you create a team, really it's just Microsoft has simplified it for you. If all you need is something simple, you can create a team. It's going to create a SharePoint site on the back end. It's also going to create an Office 365 group in the Exchange side of things. It's doing that for you behind the scenes. So you'll notice here that Teams, while one front end is talking to both of the two different data repositories on the back end. Okay. So let's get into some of the similarities of these tools, and then we'll get into when to choose them. All of them allow for cloud access. All three of them can be used in a browser. That's actually one of the nice ways to get the collaboration. You can use Office Online, and multiple people can not only share and work on an Excel spreadsheet at the same time, they can be working on a Word document at the same time. They can be working on a Visio diagram at the same time. There's a lot of applications that can be used in a collaborative mode through Office Online. We talked about the ability to collaborate. There's indexing. All the files are searchable and indexed with all of these products. They all have a version history as well. I didn't put that in the slide here, but it's one of the nice things if you go online, which you're not going to get if you sync your files down locally, is the same version history. The version history online, you can look at those three dots called the ellipses. You click on those ellipses, go to the version history, and you can get a previous version of a file. Maybe you want to revert back to something before you made changes to it. You've got that ability. So all of those products are giving you that ability. And of course, you can sync files down to your PC with SharePoint and OneDrive for Business. Just be careful if you do that. You know, today, a lot of computers have solid-state hard drives, and they're not very big. You might have a 256 gig hard drive, and you might have a SharePoint site with 300 gigs of information. And if you choose to sync that down to your PC, you're going to blow up your hard drive space very, very quickly. So that's one warning if you do sync files down. The other warning would be note that if you're interested in collaboration, if you've got a file synced locally and you go to open it in Excel as an example, it will likely open it with your local copy of Excel, not Excel Online, which does not give you the collaborative ability. Okay, so now let's get into when would I choose OneDrive. OneDrive for Business is really meant for your personal storage. It's not meant for shared storage. So think in the days of, if you've had a server on site, you might have had a home drive or a user drive. Those are files that are yours specifically and not meant to be shared out with everybody. That is really the purpose of the design of OneDrive for Business. Now, having said that, there's nothing stopping you from sharing out a folder in OneDrive. You can do that. If you've got data in OneDrive, you can share it out to other members of your team. It gives you that ability. It's just maybe not a good idea. And the reason for that comes down to our first bullet point here, is the files in OneDrive, they belong to a certain user. And if that user leaves the company or leaves, guess what? Those files go away. So if you're storing files in your OneDrive that the whole company needs, and you go away, those files go with you. That's not going to be a good scenario. So in actuality here, if you have your Azure Active Directory properly filled out, the manager will get a notification, hey, this employee is now been removed. It actually keeps the files for 30 days, gives you a chance to move them. But still, if your Azure AD is not filled out properly, your manager is not going to get that notification, and those files are just going to go away. So it's not a great place for stored data. It's meant for your personal storage. We mentioned a 1 terabyte max storage, so if that is a consideration, maybe OneDrive is not the right place. SharePoint has a 25 terabyte max, although you have to do some configuring to get it there. It does have 25 times the capacity in SharePoint. One other nice purpose for OneDrive that you're not going to get with some of the other tools here is they have a great feature for document, desktop, and picture backup. So if you open OneDrive for Business and go to the settings, you can turn that on, and we recommend that people do that. And it will sync up everything that's in those 3 libraries to a OneDrive. It's actually a SharePoint site behind the scenes, but it's your personal OneDrive site that only you have access to. And it stores those stuff up in the cloud. So if your computer were to crash and the hard drive dies and you've lost what's on there, you can recover that because it'll be stored in Microsoft's cloud. So that's something that we definitely recommend people take advantage of. So some people are paying for third-party products to back up those documents when they don't need to. They could be using OneDrive to do that. So those are great use cases for OneDrive for Business. Moving on to Teams. Teams is for active projects that benefit from collaboration. So as we mentioned, Teams is a lot more than just file storage. The other ones are primarily file storage. Teams has functions like chatting and calling. And you got to think of Teams as really a layer on top of that brings everything together. As we saw in our previous slides there, Teams is talking both to Exchange and to SharePoint, but instead of having to do different applications to access that data, it's bringing it all together. It's bringing that collaborative component together. So SharePoint is great for collaborative work. It's also, Teams is great for collaborative work, and it's also great if you have projects where you have other tools that you may want to have the data stored all in one spot. There's a lot of integrations in Teams for tools like Microsoft Planner. You can pull in plans, and many third-party apps. If you're using Asana as an example, as a project management tool, you can link your Asana account to a team. So if you have a project, let's say you've got a team for a customer and you've got a channel for a project, and you're using Asana to manage that project, you can link Asana right into Teams. So you can just click on it, and there's basic things you can do right from inside of Teams. So the integration will depend on the third-party software, how far they've gone with the integration, but it can be really handy. So Teams, great for active projects, great for collaboration. So I'm going to show you some slides here, just some examples. So here we've got a Microsoft team. Ironically, it's called Microsoft Teams. So for us, if we're deploying Microsoft Teams to a customer, we have a deployment plan. This is a Microsoft Planner plan where you create your different buckets, these are called, and then your tasks underneath. So this is a subset of our project plan for rolling out Microsoft Teams. And we've got it sitting right in Microsoft Teams itself. So if we're going to do that, we can just copy this master plan and have this project plan to deploy for customers. Another example here, we have a human resources channel and under a Colden company team, and we've added training. So we have different training things. So if we want our staff to get trained on Power Automate as an example, I can put the training, linking it right into Teams. So our guys can go right into this training channel here and access the training right from inside of Teams. So Teams is great for that, for linking things in and bringing things together in a collaborative manner. Okay, finally, when do you want to choose SharePoint? SharePoint is for shared storage, whereas, again, OneDrive is for personal storage. You want to be thinking about if you had a server with a shared drive, that's really what SharePoint is meant to replace, is having that shared data stored in the cloud. It's got the larger storage limits than OneDrive. It's better for static data than Teams. You can create File Explorer links so you can easily access them when you click on My Computer. Very easy to share files from within SharePoint, so it's great for that if you're sharing with outside people. But really, SharePoint, as I mentioned earlier, it's a complicated product. There's a lot to administering SharePoint. So if you have something with any complexity to it, maybe you've got some data governance needs, you've got to make sure that some of this data doesn't escape your network if you've got HIPAA concerns or any other financial data concerns. You can do a lot more with setting up your site directly in SharePoint. You're going to have a lot more options than if you're setting up a team, as an example. So if you need robustness, SharePoint is the place to go. And as I mentioned, there's a lot more to it. On the back end, there's a lot of settings and a lot of complexity to it. So if you're an organization that really doesn't have anyone with that skill set, then you might want to consider maybe I'll keep it simple and just create some teams, because it's actually going to create some shared storage for me, and it's really storing it in a SharePoint site on the back end. It's going to be simple. If you want to get a little more sophisticated, SharePoint's going to be a little bit more sophisticated for you. Okay, so a nice summary here. I call it me, we, us. Easy way to remember. Are these documents for me? I'm going to use OneDrive for Business. Is it we for our team? We're going to use Microsoft Teams. And us or everybody, are these documents meant for everybody? Then they should go into SharePoint. So sometimes they have this as me, we, everybody. I just think it's easier to remember me, we, us. So that's a good little way to think about it when you're thinking about your project. Which one of these tools is going to be the right fit? Is it for me? Is it for we? Or is it for us? Some final points here. Whichever one you choose, put some thought into the rollout. There's benefits to be had to sitting down and thinking about who do you want to be able to create teams, as an example. Do you want by default, everyone in your organization will be able to add teams. Is that really what you want? Think about if you had a shared drive and a server, if you let everybody go in and create folders, over time that gets kind of messy. Same thing's going to happen to your team site if you administer it the same way. So our thoughts are, let's talk about that. Let's iron that out ahead of time. Who can approve creating new teams so that you can keep things in an organized manner? So whichever one of these things you decide to roll out, give it some thought ahead of time, plan it. Some concerns might be, keeping your teams clean. There is a way to archive teams. So if you're done with a project, you can archive a particular team. What some of our customers do is once they're done with a team, they'll create a different SharePoint site in SharePoint and then copy the files into SharePoint for long-term storage. So the SharePoint is their long-term data repository. Teams is meant for more of their active roles or active projects. So that's another way you can do that. Now to do that, you have to have some SharePoint skill. So that's obviously where we come in to handle all that stuff. And of course, make sure if you have a backup in place, regardless of which one of these tools you're using, as you use it, more and more important data is going to be stored in there. Make sure you've got a backup of that. We personally would not recommend relying on Microsoft. If you've ever tried to call Microsoft, you know what I'm talking about. It takes a long time to try to recover anything get support from Microsoft. So our recommendation is there's some great third-party tools out there that will do what are called tenant-to-tenant backups. It's going to back up the Microsoft tenant to a completely different cloud. So if there's any major issues with the Microsoft cloud, your data is going to be safely stored outside of their cloud, and also gives you the flexibility to restore things on your time frame rather than waiting on Microsoft. So that's a big consideration, regardless of which one of these things you're choosing. Okay, I know we're at 11:30 here, so we'll wrap up here. Summary: OneDrive, Teams, and SharePoint all have their benefits. They all have their strong points. Picking the right platform is really going to depend on the purpose of your files. Just remember that me, we, us, and that'll help you decide. And also remember that implementing these core services really open the door to a lot of other advancements. And I gave you an example earlier of the invoice approval. Another project we did for a customer, we put in a time off form, a request for time off using Microsoft Forms, saved it in their HR channel in Teams. It allows employees to fill out the form and say, I want to have next week off, as an example. When they submit that, it automatically looks up their manager inside of Azure AD and sends them an email with the form and the request, and they can approve or reject that time off and put comments in. If they reject it, they can say why, or if they approve it, hey, have a good time. And then it will store that request in a Microsoft list so that there is a running tally of all the requests for time off. And that's all done using Power Automate, but you need to have that underlying infrastructure of Teams in place. So that's just another example of where you can go with all this once you've got the stuff in place. Okay, we'll get to some questions here. Just a reminder, if you're running your business the same way you were 2 or 3 years ago, you are not staying the same, you're falling behind. We put this on every one of our presentations just as a reminder that your competition is not staying the same. They're advancing. You need to be advancing along with them. All right, so we'll get to questions. I'm going to put my contact information up on the screen here. If you have any questions for me, feel free. There's my phone number. I'm at extension 102. My email address is there. And we've got some of our social media listed here as well. Okay, so let's look. I do see some questions that have come in. So the first one is, how do I get OneDrive for Business? Okay, so that depends on your license. So if you have a subscription, most of the subscriptions are going to have OneDrive for Business with it. So first of all, you have to have that license. Assuming you do, on your computer, you're going to go down to the Windows button and search and just type in OneDrive, and it should pop up there. When it pops up, you're going to log in with your business account, and that's what's going to trigger it to say, hey, this is a business account, this is a OneDrive for Business account, rather than a OneDrive personal. So really, it's just a matter of signing in to OneDrive with the appropriate credentials, assuming you've got the valid license. Now, for some reason you don't find OneDrive for Business on your computer, you can always go to www.office.com and you can download it from there. All right, I'm going to take one more. Any questions that I don't get to, I will save and reply to people directly. There's a few questions in here that look to be deep in the weeds, so I will note them and I'll respond to each of you individually here. But the last question I'll take is, how is Teams collaboration better than SharePoint collaboration? And I'll answer that, I guess, by saying for collaboration in terms of opening up an Excel and sharing Excel, they're going to work exactly the same. And that's because it's really SharePoint behind the scenes. So if you want to collaborate on a spreadsheet or a Word document, you can do that in both applications and it's going to work the same. So there's no advantage there. The advantage comes in Teams where you can store instant messages or chat sessions and tie them to a particular team. So you've got that history there. You can tie your files directly to a team. You can make video calling and from inside of a team where you can collaborate visually, share your screen, those types of benefits that come with Teams that you're not going to get with SharePoint. So that's where the improvement in collaboration comes into play, is via the Teams interface. It's not necessarily any better in terms of collaborating on an Excel spreadsheet. So I hope I've answered that. Okay, so at this point, I know I've run over a little bit. I want to thank everybody for taking time today to be with us. And again, feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. We're always happy to help, and that's what we're here to do. We're here to help. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks very much.